63 of Shorts Sports Shorts. Try saying that 5 times really fast. Our episode today is featuring the winner of our Sports Lawyers Association annual conference student writing competition, Maxwell Dean Becker of St. Thomas School of Law in the beautiful state of Minnesota, Rising 3L. Max, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Bobby. Appreciate it.
Well, we're glad to have you. And every year for the past, I don't even know, 10 years, maybe longer, we've had a student writing competition. And it's always interesting to see the topics because they're varied. And we just want an interesting topic. And your paper, the Rodchenkov Act, when taking our ball and going home, is unconstitutional, which begs a couple of questions that people may not know, namely, what is the act? And let's talk a little bit about the thesis of your paper. But before that, you're a Rising 3L, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you were an undergraduate at Texas A&M, home to the real 12th man.
Yes, sir.
So we're glad to have you. But I'm interested, this was obviously our winning essay. And I was just curious, why this topic? What was it that drew you to this of all things?
Sure. So, I think at my core, among everything else, I'm a fan, right? I'm a fan of sports. It was what drew me to sport law, the class that I was taking. That was the reason I ended up actually entering into the contest. It was late February. We were in class, and my professor, David Granardo, who was so encouraging and supportive of me through this whole process, was up there and he said, Hey, there's this writing contest. Maybe you guys want to get involved. I think you'd surprise yourselves at how well you might do. So start thinking of some topics. And I said, well, when's it due? He said, March 20th. So that gave me about 3 weeks to get this thing done. Coincidentally, it would fall on my birthday and a couple of days prior to my sitting for the MPRE. So I immediately started racking my brain for what I was going to write about. And I ended up saying, Professor, I'm happy to write in this thing. It sounds like a great experience, but I'm just completely slammed right now. Obviously, it's the middle of a very demanding 2L spring semester and getting ready for the MPRE, and then spring break falling kind of right as this thing was due. And I said, listen, I'll write for it, but if I win the thing, I don't have to take your final. And so he's up there and he looks at me. I'm sitting down there, right front and center. And he goes, yeah, all right, Max, if you win it, you don't have to take the final. Well, let's talk about a topic when you wrap for class for the day. So class wraps up and there was one controversy actually that was kind of at the center of my sports world about the time I found out about the contest. And there was I'm a big mixed martial arts fan. Follow the UFC pretty closely, and I'm always fascinated by it. I think it's one of the purest expressions of athleticism, and it's just wildly entertaining. There was a fight that had happened in Perth, Australia, between the current featherweight champion, Alexander Volkanovski. He was moving up to fight for the 155-pound lightweight belt against Islam Makhachev. And he ended up losing that fight in a very, very close decision. After the fact, there were some allegations that came out. There were allegations that Islam had used an IV to rehydrate. He has a terrible weight cut getting down to 155. And so he was looking for, I guess, a way to recover and fight effectively. These were largely unsubstantiated, but there were several layers and tiers that kind of there was a rabbit hole here that people inevitably ended up going down. Long story short, what got me fascinated in the Rodchenkov Act was the question of athletic jurisdiction. The UFC is governed by USADA, which means that they have to submit themselves to several doping tests to make sure the athletes are clean. Other major sporting leagues in the United States don't have to do that. They have their own substance abuse policies, which is how certain leagues you might get popped for marijuana, but not for performance enhancing drugs that would be illegal if you were participating in something like the Olympics. where all of these different authorities came to a head was in Perth. Perth is governed by the Western Australian Athletic Commission. I believe that's correct. They're also governed, because they're a UFC event, by USADA. And so the IV was illegal per USADA rules, but was legal per the Western Australia Athletic Commission. And I was just fascinated by, so who gets the final say? And as I started researching and diving deeper into this, I came across the Rodchenkov Anti-Doping Act. I've seen the movie Icarus. I think every sports fan should watch it. Award-winning documentary by Brian Fogel. It detailed all of the hoopla surrounding the Russian state-sponsored doping scandal during the Sochi Winter Olympics. It's James Bond level type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've seen it, Bobby, I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I have.
I mean, if you recall, they're passing samples through air ducts and walls, and they've compromised all of their own local anti-doping agents, and it was remarkable. So naturally, when I saw something named Rodchenkov, it caught my eye. I end up doing a little bit of research and thinking, and this will probably surprise you guys and any other listeners. I thought, when I read the text of the Rodchenkov Anti-Doping Act, I thought, this is the greatest thing we've ever done. So I wrote a paper in support of RADA. As I completed my paper, maybe March 11th or 12th, worked around the clock on the thing. Part of it was procrastinating from the MPRA, which we did very well on, but let's be real here. I realized, gosh, this is patently unconstitutional. Scrapped it and rewrote the whole thing. Basically saying that it was not constitutional, and that was the paper that I ended up sending to you guys. That paper is actually close to 10,000 words, and it's really three parts. It's what is it, why is it unconstitutional, and then the last part is why it needs to be repealed. I was fascinated by it, especially in the current environment with things like Live Golf, Russian athletes being banned from competition in certain settings amid the invasion of Ukraine. And all these different things. So again, to make a very long story shorter, it was a combination of kind of salient events in my own fandom, as well as current events that drew me to writing about the Rodchenkov Act.
Well, it's really interesting because this is a subject that we've talked a lot about in the sports law universe on a number of levels, but I think you've raised what seems to be really a conflicts of law question, and how it really sorts out in the real world. So for those law students out there that may be listening or may check this later, real life subject that you don't want to pay attention to really matters, because now you have a situation here where, for example, from the perspective of an athlete, if I'm out there competing, what are the rules? And you cite a perfect example that sort of piqued your interest. Am I governed by the USADA rules that control the organization that's sponsoring or that's putting on the event in which I'm participating? Or am I subject to some local jurisdictional rules? And does one have supremacy over the other? And if not, how do they get sorted out? So from an athlete's perspective, you're raising a really important question, which is, I want to compete. What are the rules? And then what happens when there's a conflict in the rules? And I think in your paper, that's a lot of what you're talking about is this conflict, is it just confusing or is it unconstitutional? So let's talk about where you came out on that.
Well, Bobby, I think it's both. It's terribly confusing for the same reasons which it is unconstitutional. RADA comes across a few hurdles, and just kind of will preface with exactly what it does and what it is. I'm not going to read you the definition, but when I read it and I kind of internalized it, I found it very surprising that RADA makes it illegal in American jurisdiction. It makes it a crime in America for any person on the planet to participate in an international doping scheme as defined by the act, except for the athlete himself. So this whole program of training staff and coaches and financiers and even politicians, all of these people are subjecting themselves by the act to American prosecution if they participate in one of these doping schemes. That's shocking to me. It's unconstitutional for three main reasons, and there may very well be more, but this was what I was able to glean and what I found most salient. There are two kind of threshold hurdles, which are what we'll call nexus requirements. The first nexus is a commercial nexus. The act purports to entrench itself by the Commerce Clause, namely the Foreign Commerce Clause. They're able to do so, allegedly, because the Foreign Commerce Clause allows Congress to regulate commerce with foreign nations. This makes sense. The problem with RADA is that that's not what it does. What RADA is really intended to do is create a kind of global, comprehensive regulatory scheme about who's allowed to participate in which sorts of functions, so long as an American has anything to do with it at any point. That is tremendously overbroad. And if that is the case, then the foreign conspirator in the foreign land with a foreign athlete, nothing is beyond the reach of the Foreign Commerce Clause. The second nexus requirement is an international law nexus requirement. And there are two that are fairly controversial and fairly salient here. The first is the universality principle, which is basically the idea that a foreign national won't be deprived of his due process if he's brought in on RADA charges, because doping in sport, which we'll just call it, cheating is so egregious that any human being on the planet ought to be aware that his conduct is universally condemned. To me, I can't get on board with that, especially in light of other acts that have failed to utilize the universality principle. For example, international drug trafficking. There are hundreds of states that have signed on to conventions against international drug trafficking. And because a couple of those states fail to enforce their own laws on international drug trafficking, because in some cases they profit from it, the universality principle can't apply. Any dissent or any sponsorship of these kind of behaviors seems to prevent an act from availing itself of the universality principle. The second international nexus is the passive personality principle. I believe the passive personality principle to be a very, very sharp sword that should be used exceedingly rarely. The idea is that because an American is the victim of the conduct, then we can go get the perpetrator. There are times when that makes perfect sense. But for Congress to claim that the victim is the American audience watching at home, I'm not on board there. This is something I couldn't include in my paper, but the act provides for restitution to victims. So I'm sitting here wondering how on earth we're going to get these guys to pay me restitution when I watch the Olympics, and it just so happens that 4 years down the line we discovered that people were doped. And the last point that I'd like to make, and why I believe that RADA is unconstitutional, is it falls on the wrong side of the foreign concern question. And the foreign concern question is a bundle. It appears to me a bundle of established kind of political theories and political science theories that govern our modern statehood world. It's what RADA essentially does, Bobby, is it says that Max's household has passed a law that says Bobby's household will not eat steak on Thursdays. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's bizarre to think that you and I, who up until this paper have had no prior connection or relationship, it's bizarre for me to think that I can establish rules that will govern your behavior, especially when there's something like a treaty. If RADA was a treaty, it'd be fine. I think in almost every way, if it was signed on to willingly by member states. So there's a rambling description of why I think it's unconstitutional and my take generally on it.
Well, I think you're raising a really interesting point, which is oftentimes I think legislators try to shortcut the process to get to an answer. So their goal is to have sanctions for anyone that is in some sort of conspiracy surrounding doping in very basic terms. But again, how does the US have the reach against people that are not citizens of the US or people participating outside of the US? Your nexus arguments are, I think, compelling, because this is almost like it's a statute, but it's aspirational. And I think if it were challenged, even on standing grounds, it's going to have big problems, because you're going to tell me how I'm supposed to behave? I'm an athlete in another country, and you're going to say something to me about what I did based upon your law, to which, where's the jurisdiction over me? I mean, it's a very weak argument. And I think you did a really great job of pointing it out, in terms of the analogy you gave of, I can't tell what happens in Bobby's house. He didn't sign on to a treaty. He didn't agree to this. It's not like, I think we have to be clear that there are things like, all the member states that have signed on to WADA. So everybody knows that, and individual jurisdictions, we have USADA here in the US, but it's pretty much in line with WADA, and everybody signs on and says, we're a participant. We agree to make, clean sport, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But until I'd read your paper, I did not know about the Rodchenkov Act. And I read it and I thought to myself, how did this pass muster? And I can't imagine there's been any cases challenging it. Have there? Are you aware of any?
There's been one case, Bobby, as far as I know. When I was doing the research here, some things may have developed, but there was one case that was still ongoing. There was a situation where RADA was actually pretty well insulated, which was disappointing. It was a doctor who I believe was based in New York, and he was providing services to an athlete who was either competing or was based in El Paso. So the territorial jurisdiction was completely fine. The extraterritoriality was never questioned. And I think in that case, if we want to make laws that govern what happens within our borders, especially under the Commerce Clause, we've established that that's completely acceptable.
Yep.
And so I would imagine that case, he'll be tried and convicted of a RADA violation. But where, like I said, I think where this really struggles is when we try to make rules for how other people's houses function.
Yeah, obviously, I mean, we can't control that. Now, if you wanted to go to the folks at WADA and say, look, we have this act here in the US, we think it's really important, and on your sanctions, you should add this conspiracy prong to potential violations of doping, then I think, it has some strength. But again, as I said just a few seconds ago, this is an aspirational law, and an aspirational law is, just by calling it aspirational, you're asking for someone to call it unconstitutional for vagueness and overbroadness.
I agree 100%.
And so yet this is sitting out there. Have you found any specific examples? I mean, you just talked about you opened talking about the UFC matter. Do you have any other examples of where they've tried to enforce Rodchenkov anywhere outside of the
So
U.S.?
I've not. And that kind of wraps up into the real second step issue that Rod is going to face, and why I thought the title "When Taking Our Ball and Going Home" is unconstitutional was correct here. You know, I'm even if this survives some constitutional challenges to either of the nexus questions, and even if it somehow survives the foreign concern question, I'm trying to figure out how on earth we're going to charge and bring in all of Russian senior leadership within Moscow. I mean, this Icarus showed us that the roots of these doping schemes in authoritarian states, which rely on athletic achievement for a political point boost, they're all involved. And so to me, it's very, very bold when we're trying to exert soft power the world over to say, by the way, all of your political candidates and senior office holders that have even touched sport during the time of any of these international doping scandals, like, we're saying they're all criminals, which doesn't exactly help you win friends. And
notwithstanding the fact that we can agree that they're probably all criminals, but go on nonetheless.
Right. Exactly. Saying the quiet part out loud. The situations with how do we get a hold of these people, right? The messaging is one thing, but then actually going and getting them seems, just completely impractical and actually probably impossible. But I think, we talk about sports washing as kind of a really big thing happening today. I'm a Formula One fan, love it. Very, very entertaining. Formula One is a situation where there is some sports washing going on. How about Live Golf? The former, I guess, Live Golf.
That's the ace example.
It's just blatant, and I think we do maybe a better job. But to say that sports are separate from politics in America is also not true. I think this is probably a situation where, and I don't know how everybody voted, but it, 2019, and it was introduced by a Democrat and signed by President Trump. It seems like this might have been some form of a boost for representatives being able to say, hey, listen, yeah, it's aspirational. Yeah, it's out there, but we're going to try to pass it anyway so that we can say we're being tough on this sports washing, cheating, anti-fair play, anti-clean sport culture developing in a lot of our geopolitical rivals. Maybe that's my political science background speaking a little too loudly, but to ignore kind of the real practical function of what a law like this would mean for a candidate. I mean, to me, that's probably one of the reasons, if not the leading reason, as something like this gets passed.
Many years ago when I was a law student, I had an evidence professor who had us analyze evidentiary questions by doing both a textual and a contextual analysis. And this is one of those where when you look at it in context, I think what you're suggesting makes a lot of sense. Oh, let's show an act that shows that we're really tough, because the electorate doesn't understand that what we're telling them is unenforceable, but it sounds really good. We just put lipstick on a pig.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, it doesn't really achieve anything, because I think, as you did a really terrific job of pointing out, is it says all of this stuff and it says what it's going to do. And does anybody, I would say the majority of sports fans, would anybody argue that, the conspiracy to evade drug protocols and drug testing and to cheat like that? I mean, I still am scarred from the 1972 Olympics when the East German women's swim team looked like men. and set world records. And then years later, it was proved that they were all super drugged, right? And that just, it's not a fair playing field. And that's what, if the Olympic model is about fairness and bringing the world together, et cetera, then the people that cheat, particularly in that context, ought to be held accountable. And I think between what WADA has done through the Olympic program, and I think if you look at all the CAS hearings around a lot of those WADA cases, if you take drugs and you get caught, you lose. You're going to get stripped of your medal, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think anybody has an issue with that, but it's this overreach. And again, we need help with cleaning up. Well, we could start with the 1972 Copyright Act. That would be a good place to start. Or we could look at, getting serious NIL litigation that is, threatening to rip apart college athletics, of which I think we're both huge fans. And yet we end up with this law that is, again, lipstick on a pig. My feeling after having read about this and studied it, because yeah, great. We don't want people to dope. And if you're party to this doping scandal, not just the athlete's going to lose his medal, but you, the enabler, you, the drug giver, you, the cover-upper, are also liable for sanctions. I don't know how you enforce it. I mean, it sounds great, but it has no teeth. And this is an interesting thing. And I think your paper points out, to my mind's eye, something really important, which is nobody believes that all of sport is perfectly clean. We want it to be. We want the leveling field to be, level for all athletes, to have the same opportunity to compete and see who the best are. And with the rise of WADA over the years and how USADA has followed suit, we have systems in place where athletes know they're going to get tested. They're aware of what the penalties are. They're aware of the, all the protocols. If you want to try to game the system, at least you know what the game is.
Yeah.
This and something like this is a law that, what does it really do? Creates litigation for somebody to say, no, you can't sue me. You can't sue my doctor because he did this, because you cheated me out of it. Where's that relationship? And to use the Foreign Commerce Clause is, it would seem, the only arguable statutory basis on which to even hang a hat on this. And it's a pretty weak hook that's about to fall off the wall. So I don't really know where you're going to hang it. But thank you for the paper. I think it is a really good thing, because over the years, there's been so much talk about, the general nature of testing and what athletes have to go through and the sanctions and various things. But why in the world of trying to get things better do you throw something at a wall and hope it sticks?
I agree 100%, Bobby. I think, and I thought you really identified exactly how we all feel. We want sport to be clean. Disliking RADA and believing it to be unconstitutional is in no way an endorsement of dirty play. It's it's an imperfect solution, right? And what I would love to see is for the West and for anybody who's willing to participate, who truly wants fair play and clean play, which I believe to be pretty much everybody, with the exception of a couple of repeat offenders. I'd love to see them all get together and work with CAS, because right now the penalties that CAS can hand down, it's very minimal for an athlete. Other than stripping the medal is just that would be just heartbreaking for the athlete, but they're back in the arena in a couple of years. So I would like to see, instead of passing stuff like this, which, like you said, lipstick on a pig, no teeth, unenforceable, I'd like to see folks getting together, working together, and strengthening the international community so that we have something that has a little bit of bite behind it to go get these people and keep them out of sport. But from a place that sponsors international cooperation rather than the situation like where in this case the United States taking its ball and going home.
Yeah, look, I mean, clearly, all these doping cases, who suffers? The athlete. And the athlete loses it. All the people behind them, whether it was forced as it was in the 70s and 80s in the then Soviet bloc, where you were in a training program and it was, here, come get your shot, come get your shot. You know, why am I so big? Am I working out? What's happening in my body? Just the states enforcing it. But there was never no sanctions against the state and what they did. So maybe I think you're raising the question is, you know, hey, WADA, let's go after the enablers. Let's go after those people that are causing the athletes. Don't just put it all on the athletes. So many of them, especially I think in the repeat offenders, as you so politically correctly referred to them, those repeat offenders, you know, you've got to just tell them that they'll have sanctions for those doctors, those sports federation heads, et cetera, that knowingly allow this to go on. That's how you're going to clean up sports. And until then, the athlete gets the short end of the stick yet again. So thank you for your time. I'm going to let you get back to your northern Minnesota vacation there in the cabin.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you for taking part in our competition this year. You know, and again, folks, go to sportslaw.org and become a member of the Sports Lawyers Association for programmings like this, for our webinars, for our mid-year symposium that we're holding in the 1st of November, November 2nd, which will be on AI and sports. And then for our annual conference in May, which this year's topic will be the collision of sports and culture. So it's all very interesting. A lot of good stuff we have to offer. Max, thank you so much for taking part in our competition. Wish you luck in the most boring year of your life, which is called your 3L year, but we all had to go through it. And good luck with whatever is next. And thank you for taking part in our organization's event. And I wish you all the best in your professional career.
Thanks, Bobby. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Take care.